On the morning my boss's son handed me a termination letter, I was wearing the same blazer I had worn the day I defended my patent applications before a federal examiner. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I folded the letter in half, slid it into my bag, and looked him directly in the eyes. He smirked. 3 hours later, he had 47 missed calls from the Secretary of Transportation's office, and absolutely no idea why. My name is Elena. I am 31 years old. And what happened next is something I had been quietly preparing for the better part of 2 years. I need you to understand something about the firm before I tell you the rest. Hartwell Infrastructure Group was not built by my boss. It was built by his father, a man named Gerald Hartwell, who had spent 30 years turning a two-person civil engineering consultancy into one of the most respected structural design firms on the East Coast. Gerald was sharp, demanding, occasionally ruthless, but he had earned every inch of his reputation with real work and real risk. His son, Brandon, had earned nothing. Brandon was 26 years old, had a business degree from a university his father had donated a building to, and had been handed the title of Executive Vice President 8 months ago, when Gerald suffered a mild stroke and stepped back from daily operations. In those 8 months, Brandon had reorganized the office seating chart 3 times, fired our longest-tenured project manager for disagreeing with him in a meeting, and taken personal credit for a highway interchange design I had spent 14 months developing. I was the lead structural engineer at Hartwell. I had been with the firm for 6 years. Every major contract the company had landed in the last 4 years had either been designed by me, approved by my technical review, or built on computational frameworks I had developed myself. The crown jewel of everything I had ever done was a proprietary load distribution modeling system I called the Meridian Framework. It was not a simple spreadsheet or a borrowed methodology. It was a genuinely novel approach to calculating stress tolerance in composite bridge structures, and I had spent 3 years building it from scratch in my own time, on my own equipment, before I ever brought it to Hartwell. I had filed for patent protection before I licensed it to the firm for use on client projects. My husband had made absolutely certain of that. Marcus is 34 years old. He is an intellectual property attorney, and he is the most methodical human being I have ever encountered. When we were dating and I first told him about the Meridian Framework, he did not ask me how it worked. He asked me who owned it. When I told him I had developed it independently before joining Hartwell, he sat down with me for an entire Saturday and walked me through every document I would need to establish ironclad ownership. That was 3 years before any of this happened. Marcus is the kind of man who thinks several moves ahead, not out of paranoia but out of deep, steady competence. When I eventually told him that Brandon Hartwell had started showing my work to potential clients without crediting me, Marcus simply nodded, refreshed his coffee, and said, "Good. Let him keep going." The federal contract that set everything in motion was the Dunmore Corridor Bridge project. It was a $340 million commission from the U.S. Department of Transportation to redesign and reinforce a deteriorating bridge network spanning 14 miles of interstate in 3 states. Hartwell had been shortlisted for the project 18 months ago. I had personally led every stage of the technical submission, flying to Washington twice, presenting our methodology to a federal review panel, and answering 4 rounds of follow-up questions from government engineers. The Meridian Framework was the centerpiece of our entire proposal. The federal reviewers had specifically cited it by name in their preliminary approval letter as the reason Hartwell was selected over 3 larger competing firms. The contract signing was scheduled for a Tuesday in March. Gerald had been well enough to fly up from his home in Florida specifically for the occasion. It was going to be the single largest contract in Hartwell's history. Brandon fired me on the Monday afternoon before. I was at my desk reviewing the final signature packet when his assistant appeared in my doorway and asked me to come to the conference room. I assumed it was a last-minute briefing. Instead, I found Brandon seated at the head of the table with a human resources representative I had never seen before and a manila envelope sitting on the glass surface between them. Brandon did not stand up when I walked in. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me the way someone looks at a household appliance they have decided to replace. He said the firm was restructuring its technical leadership ahead of the new contract period. He said my role was being eliminated. He said it with the flat affect of someone reading from a script he had rehearsed once in a mirror. The HR representative slid the manila envelope across the table. Inside was a termination letter, an NDA, a non-compete clause covering a 2-year period and a geographic radius that would have made it nearly impossible for me to work in my field in any neighboring state, and a severance offer that amounted to 6 weeks of pay. Brandon told me to clean out my desk by end of business. He told me my building access and system credentials would be revoked at 5 o'clock. He said he appreciated my contributions and wished me well. Then he looked back down at his phone. I sat with the envelope for exactly 4 seconds. Then I picked it up, thanked the HR representative by name, told Brandon I hoped tomorrow went smoothly, and walked out of the conference room. I did not sign a single page of what was inside that envelope. I called Marcus from the elevator before the doors had finished closing. He answered on the first ring. I told him what had happened. There was a brief silence, and then he said, "Don't touch the desk. Don't log out of anything, don't swipe out, and don't sign anything they give you. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I want to tell you something about that walk back to my office." I passed colleagues who smiled at me, unaware. I passed the framed rendering of the Dunmore Corridor project mounted on the wall near the reception area, the one with my name in the technical credits. I passed the small conference room where Gerald Hartwell and I had spent a late evening 2 years prior, going over load tolerances, while he told me, with genuine warmth, that I was the best hire the firm had ever made. I felt none of the things Brandon had expected me to feel. I did not feel an well-made one funded by an injurious dialogue, but secretly funded the particular calm that comes from knowing exactly what you are holding in your hand. Marcus arrived with his briefcase and a to-go cup of coffee. He handed to me without a word. We sat in my office with the door closed, and he walked me through what was going to happen. He had drafted contingency documents for this scenario 6 months earlier and kept them current. He reminded me that the Meridian framework was my intellectual property, registered under my name, licensed to Hartwell under a contract that contained a specific and enforceable clause. If Hartwell terminated my employment without documented cause, the licensing agreement was void. Without the licensing agreement, Hartwell had no legal right to use, present, or benefit from the Meridian framework in any capacity, including on contracts secured to its use. By firing me the day before the Dunmore signing, Brandon had just told the federal government that the firm presenting their centerpiece methodology tomorrow morning no longer had the legal authority to use it. We left the building at 4:59. I swiped my badge on the way out. I did not clean my desk. The call came at 7:40 the next morning. I was eating breakfast. Marcus was reviewing documents at the kitchen table. My phone lit up with a number I recognized as Hartwell's main line. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again from Brandon's direct line. Then from the HR representative. Then from a Washington area code I did not recognize. Marcus looked up from his documents, glanced at my phone screen and said, "That's the liaison." I poured myself more coffee and let it ring. What had happened, as Marcus explained it to me later, with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching a theorem prove itself, was exactly what we had anticipated. Brandon had arrived at the signing ceremony that morning, prepared to present himself as the visionary executive behind the Hartwell proposal. He had prepared remarks. He had a new business card with his title printed in a slightly larger font. What he had not prepared for was the federal contracting officer opening the morning session by asking to confirm the current employment status of the Meridian Framework's patent holder. Because the DOT's legal department had reviewed the licensing structure as part of standard due diligence and flagged that the agreement contained a termination clause. Brandon had not known about the termination clause. He had never read the licensing agreement. In the 14 months I had been developing the Dunmore proposal, he had reviewed exactly 0 pages of any underlying legal document, and had simply assumed that because I worked at Hartwell, everything I created belonged to Hartwell. It was the most expensive assumption he would ever make. The ceremony was halted. The federal contract officer sent a formal notice to Hartwell's registered legal address, stating that the DOT could not proceed with the signing until the firm demonstrated valid and current licensing rights to the Meridian framework. Until that was resolved, the Dunmore Corridor Bridge project was an administrative hold. Marcus and I drove to the office at 10 o'clock. I will not pretend I did not enjoy walking back through those doors. I had dressed deliberately. A charcoal gray suit I had bought for a conference 2 years ago and never worn, because I had been saving it without quite knowing for what. Marcus carried his briefcase, We rode the elevator to the 4th floor and walked to the conference room. Brandon was inside with the firm's general counsel, 2 members of the board, and a woman I did not recognize who turned out to be a communications consultant. Someone had called in a panic. Gerald Hartwell was on a video call displayed on the wall screen, still in Florida, still visibly unwell, but present and furious. Brandon looked at me the way people look at something they cannot logically explain. Then he looked at Marcus. Then he looked at Marcus. Then he looked back at me. Gerald spoke first, from the screen. His voice was thinner than I remembered, but carried the same authority. He said, "Elena, I owe you an apology and an explanation. I have asked Brandon to step out of the room." Brandon did not move immediately. He looked at his father's image on the screen and then at the board members seated at the table waiting for someone to contradict the instruction. No one did. He pushed back his chair and left. Over the next 2 hours, Marcus laid out the position clearly and without theatrics. The licensing agreement was void as of the moment of my termination. Hartwell could not use the Meridian framework, could not reference it in client materials, could not present it to the DOT, and could not benefit from the selection criteria that had been based upon it, without entering into a new licensing agreement with me directly. We were prepared to discuss terms. We were not prepared to be rushed or pressured. The federal contract would hold until this was resolved, and the longer it held, the more it would cost the firm in penalties and reputational damage. The general counsel looked like he needed a significant amount of water. The board members looked at each other with the expression of people who had installed a 26-year-old with a borrowed title into a position of authority, and were now experiencing the consequences of that decision with remarkable speed. Gerald asked what I needed. Marcus set a document on the table. It was a proposed restructuring of the licensing agreement, including a substantial royalty percentage on all contracts utilizing the framework, retroactive credit and public attribution on all prior projects, and a restoration of my position with a revised title, a revised compensation structure, and a direct reporting line to the board rather than to Brandon. There was also a clause requiring the firm to provide a written acknowledgement that my termination had been unlawful and without cause, which would protect me from the non-compete and NDA I had never signed. There was silence for a moment. Then Gerald said from the screen, "Done. All of it." Brandon found out what his father had agreed to when the board's chairman walked into his office and told him directly. I am told he threw a coffee mug at the wall. I am told he called Gerald and screamed at him for 20 minutes. I am told he threatened to involve attorneys to challenge the licensing agreement to go to the press. What he actually did, once his own legal counsel reviewed the documents Marcus had prepared and explained to him in very small words that he had no viable path to a different outcome, was nothing. He sat in his office for the remainder of the day and then did not come in on Wednesday. The Dunmore Corridor contract signed on Thursday. My name was on the signature page as lead technical architect. The federal contracting officer shook my hand and said he had read my patent filings and found them impressive. The DOT press release cited the Meridian framework by name and attributed its development to me. Gerald called me privately that evening and told me that the moment he was well enough to resume an active role, he intended to make significant changes to the firm's leadership structure. I told him I appreciated that and that I hoped he felt better soon. I meant it. I need to tell you what happened with my mother and my sister, because that part of the story matters too. Some damage does not come from the office. Some of it has lived in your chest since childhood and simply waits for a moment of vulnerability to make itself known. My mother had never approved of my career, not because she doubted my ability, but because she had a specific vision of what a successful woman looked like, and structural engineering was not part of that picture. She had spent years making small comments about the hours I worked, about the fact that Marcus and I had not started a family yet, about my sister's life, which she presented as a kind of corrective example. My sister had married a man who worked in finance and hosted dinner parties, and wore the right clothes to the right events. My mother referenced these dinner parties more often than was reasonable. When word got out, through my mother, somehow, that I'd been fired, the calls started almost immediately. My mother's voice on the phone was the particular blend of concern and satisfaction that I had spent 31 years learning to recognize. She said she had heard what happened. She asked if I was all right, and then, before I could answer, she told me that maybe this was a sign, that maybe this had been too much pressure for too long. That some careers look very impressive on paper but cost more than they give back. She asked if Marcus and I had thought about moving closer to home. She suggested, gently, that my sister's husband might have a contact who could help me find something more manageable. I listened to the entire thing, then I told her I had to go and that I would call her back. I did not call her back that evening. The next morning, once the board meeting had concluded and the terms were in writing, I called her from the parking garage of the Hartwell building with my new contract open on my phone. I told her what had happened. I told her about the licensing agreement, the dot hold, the board meeting, and the terms. I told her my new title, my new salary, and the royalty structure. There was a very long pause. My mother said, "Well, I did not know all of that." I told her that I knew she didn't. I also told her, calmly and without anger, that the comments she had made the evening before had stayed with me, and that I needed her to understand something. I did not need her to manage my career or compare it to anyone else's. I did not need suggestions about what was manageable. What I needed, when something difficult happened, was for her to ask how I was doing before she offered a conclusion. I told her I loved her and that I was not interested in having that kind of conversation again. Then I said goodbye and hung up. She called back 3 hours later. She apologized, not with the elaborate performance of someone deflecting blame, but with the straightforward brevity of someone who had thought it over and recognized the truth. It was the most honest conversation we had had in years. My sister called the following day. She had heard the full story from my mother by then, which meant she had also heard the royalty figures, which had a clarifying effect on the conversation. She asked how I had known to protect the patent before joining the firm. I told her that Marcus had walked me through it before we were even engaged. She was quiet for a moment, and then said she had always found Marcus a little intense. I told her that was precisely why I married him. Brandon resigned from Hartwell 11 days after the board meeting, citing a desire to pursue other opportunities. The firm's press release was 3 sentences long. Gerald returned to an active advisory role the following month. The Dunmore Corridor project broke ground that fall on schedule with my framework at its core and my name in the project documentation. I want to tell you about the last time I saw Brandon, because it happened in a way I did not plan and could not have scripted. It was about 6 weeks after his resignation. I was at a conference in Philadelphia presenting updated research on the Meridian framework to a room of about 200 engineers. The presentation had gone well. I was in the hotel lobby afterward, talking with 2 researchers from a university program, when I saw him. He was standing near the check-in desk in a sport coat that looked slightly too big for him, holding a lanyard from a different conference happening in the same building, something to do with commercial real estate development. He had clearly pivoted. He saw me at the same moment I saw him. I watched him calculate whether to approach, whether to leave, whether to pretend he had not seen me at all. I gave him nothing. I simply continued my conversation. He eventually turned and walked toward the elevator bank. One of the researchers I was speaking with asked if I knew him. I said I used to work with him briefly. She nodded and went on with what she was saying, and I let the conversation continue, and that was the end of it. That is the part that people do not always understand about this kind of outcome. The most satisfying moment was not the board meeting, or the contract signing, or even the royalty check that arrived 3 months later. The most satisfying moment was standing in that hotel lobby and feeling absolutely nothing when I saw him. No anger, no triumph that needed expressing. Just the clean, quiet fact of having built something he could not touch, and a life he could not reach. Marcus and I did eventually take the vacation we had postponed during the contract negotiations. We went to a rented house on the coast of Maine for 10 days. We read books and walked on the beach and cooked dinner every night, and did not talk about work unless we wanted to. One morning, I was sitting on the porch with coffee, watching the ocean, and Marcus came out and sat next to me and asked what I was thinking about. I told him I was thinking about how different everything could have looked if I had signed that termination agreement, if I had not filed the patents when he told me to. If I had believed even for a moment that I needed Brandon Hartwell's approval to know what I was worth. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You never needed his approval. You just needed him to move." That is the truest thing anyone has said to me about any of this. I had spent 6 years at Hartwell doing genuinely excellent work, And the entire time, the most dangerous assumption I carried was that people in positions of authority would eventually recognize it on their own. They do not always. Sometimes the system protects the person with the title, not the person with the talent. And so you do not wait for the system to notice you. You build something the system cannot take. You file the paperwork. You read the contracts. You find someone who knows what you are worth before you are ever in a room with someone who doesn't. When I got back from Maine, I had 3 new licensing inquiries from firms who had read about the Dunmore project. I also had a message from a federal agency asking if I had any interest in consulting on a new structural standards framework they were developing. I responded to all of them. The Meridian framework is currently licensed to 4 firms in 3 states. There are 2 more pending applications. Every dollar from those licenses belongs to me, not to a company that almost discarded me on a Monday afternoon because a 26-year-old with an unearned title needed to feel powerful for a day. I used to wonder sometimes what I would say to Brandon if I were ever given the chance to address him directly. I spent some time on that question. I have given up on it because I realize now that I have nothing to say to him. He is simply someone who made a very expensive mistake and then had to live inside the consequences of it. I bear him no particular ill will. I am not softened toward him either. He occupies exactly the amount of my attention that a closed chapter deserves, which is none. What I think about instead is the version of myself who, 6 years ago, was a relatively junior engineer walking into a firm for the first time with a framework she had built alone, unsure whether anyone would take it seriously. I think about the late nights and the federal review panels, and the Saturday mornings Marcus and I spent at the kitchen table going through documents that I did not fully understand yet, but was determined to learn. I think about all the moments when the easier path would have been to let someone else own what I had made, to trade protection for belonging, to shrink myself into a shape that made the room more comfortable. I did not take that path. I am very glad I didn't. Tell me about a time you refused to settle. Leave it in the comments because I read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.